roses, tulips, astilbe, lilies, and a mixture of ground covers and shrubs that allow for a really, really pleasing composition in this rock garden. And the rock paths and steps allow you to get closer to the plants, which are labeled, by the way. You can see some of the labels in here. For example, right there. This is the original farmhouse, and the original barn is back here. The two existing buildings are used as an information center, a gift shop, education classrooms, and a cafe. They're landscaped, this area is landscaped as it might have been around a working farm 50 to 100 years ago. Down here, you can see some of the plants. I don't know if you can identify any of these, but there's poppies in here and lycoris, and there's a lot of things back in here, but I'm too far away from it to identify it. Now, I wanted to show you some of the plant families that were represented in the garden. This first family was my favorite. I purchased seeds for this poppy because I have a blue garden and I wanted this beautiful blue plant. However, they are not kidding when they say it's difficult to start from seed. I tried a bunch of their suggestions, but not one seed sprouted. The lily family is also represented. This one was donated by a botanic garden in Siberia. It looks a lot to me like our smaller shooting star wildflower, but that is in a totally different family. That's in the primrose family, and this is a lily. The herb garden is located close to the house, just as it would have been originally, and there's lots of cool weather herbs, no basil. The sea holly here is used decoratively first, and then once it's dry, it's used for jaundice, egg, dropsy, snake bites, and a whole lot of other things. One interesting collection was that of a classic northern Norway garden. There were roses, tulips, lilies, phlox, primroses, irises, and even at 70 degrees latitude, cherry and apple trees. The staff calls this collection the fossil garden. The plants are remnants of club mosses and the fern trees from about 350 million years ago. They talk to us about the field horsetail, which has become a nuisance in their garden. And we have that in our Japanese garden here, and we've tried a bunch of things, but we can't get rid of it completely. This one surprised me. I learned that these Delosperma evolved in Africa, and here they are in an Arctic botanical garden surviving beautifully. My guess is that they evolved on the slopes of one of the high mountains in Africa, such as Kilimanjaro, where if you climb to the top, I haven't, but if you do, it involves trekking through ever-changing biomes. So somewhere it must be perfect for Delosperma to have evolved. And at first I was really surprised that Norway could grow rhododendrons, but then if you think about it, the rhododendrons evolved in the Himalayas with acid soil, which is exactly what we've got in Norway. So some of them should at least be able to survive in Norway. And there's even a North American collection. Everybody here should recognize this as Louisia. And finally, I love this collection of tulips in a rock garden. I think that just is so lush, and it's much lower, so it's not as windswept as the rock garden with the saxifrage. So now we're going to go further south, about 10 degrees south, to St. Petersburg, Russia, the site of several imperial park-like gardens that were created for Peter the Great and his wife, Catherine. To understand the origins of these gardens, you need to know a little about Peter. He was born in 1672 and became a Khazar at the ripe age of 10. His tutors were from Europe. And because of this, Peter became familiar with Western culture. He felt it was far superior to the almost medieval culture existing in Russia at that time. Also, as a child, he became fascinated with ships and navies, but Russia was pretty much landlocked, so they didn't have a navy. After Peter visited Europe, he decided to move the capital of the Russian Empire from Moscow to a new site on the Neva River. Here's the Neva River right here, which had just recently been freed from centuries of Swedish domination. So this allowed Peter access to the Baltic, which then, of course, goes into the Atlantic, and he has access to the world oceans. He dragged his court and officials, kicking and screaming, to the swamps around the Neva, where he built a beautiful city and Russia's first navy. This is the palace grounds. It's right on the water. This is the Bay of Finland, and the palace itself is right here. This is about a 50-foot cliff or bluff that runs down about 100 yards to the water. The main part of the garden is below the palace down here. And the upper, in Peter's time, the upper garden was the palace kitchen garden. While he was in Europe, Peter visited Versailles and was so impressed that he modeled his palace and grounds over on the French palace. In the middle of this photo is the Grand Canal in the lower garden, and the vista is typical for the lower park. This is the palace from below the bluff, and it looks very imposing, but it's really not very big. It's only about 30 rooms. The grand staircase going down the bluff is imposing, but this and this, which look like stairs, are actually waterfalls, and the stairs for people are outside of that area. Here's one set, and there's another set over on this side. Above the structure is the great terrace. That would be right along here, where you can see these people. And an interesting feature of the garden is that there are no pumps for the fountains. On the upper level, there are natural springs which feed reservoirs. The difference in elevation creates the pressure which drives the fountains. You can see this in action on the west side of Toffus Park, near the entrance to the zoo, if you're not familiar with this concept of fountain, driving the fountains. The little building in the back over here is the original church, but it's now the entrance gate. And the big fountain in the middle of the pool, this is an important fountain here. It's called the Samson Fountain. The Samson Fountain is of symbolic importance. It shows Samson forcing open the lion's mouth. Because the lion is found in the coat of arms of Sweden, this fountain represents the freeing of the Baltic from Sweden's dominance, which it's had since the days of the Vikings. Looking down the main canal from the terrace, you can see the similarity to Versailles. At the end of the canal is the Bay of Finland and Peter's precious access to the world's oceans. Each of the little white spots down the canal is a fountain, and perpendicular to the fountain are walks. They're down here, there's several of them that you can see crossing the fountain, or crossing the canal rather. These walks are full of statuary, more fountains, lawns, woodlands, hedges, groves, flower beds, as well as several other buildings. This building is called the Montplaisir Palace, and it was the first building built on the grounds. Catherine and Peter lived in the building, supposedly doing their own cooking and laundry while the Peterhof Palace was being built. The other building is a guest palace called the Hermitage, which is not open to visitors. Here are two of these little white spot fountains that you can see up close. There's another fountain, large fountain called the Sun Fountain, and it doesn't have any particular significance that I know of. One feature of the garden, though, that I haven't mentioned are what we're calling the joke fountains. These spray water on guests who step on a certain stone or who reach for a piece of fruit in a bowl on the fountain. With so many people in the garden, we were sprayed a couple of times as we walked along. Besides the fountains, there are hundreds of statues, mostly in the Greek and Roman styles. And then on the upper level, the formal gardens replace the original kitchen garden. These consist of formal beds of annuals and perennials, or they can be consist of shrubs sheared in geometrical forms. You can see there are other fountains here as well. Or they can be made of simple cut grass, cut in beautiful patterns and totally weed-free. There's a conservatory in the lower garden, which has been turned into a botanical garden. Plants are all labeled, but after all of the open spaces and the precise geometry of the other gardens, this garden seems to be a rather large jumble, but interesting. And inside the building, tropical plants are featured. These are water lilies about 10 feet across. The Peterhof is not the only imperial palace in St. Petersburg. My favorite was this one. This is Catherine Palace. We were supposed to be focusing on gardens, but this building is just so spectacular. It's hard not to just look at that. It was originally built for Catherine I, Peter's wife, who was not Catherine the Great. She came a century later. When it was built, this was a very modest building, but it was remodeled by Peter's daughter, Eugenie, into the current structure. As you can see, the formal grass designs are like those of the Peterhof, and indeed similar to the other imperial gardens in St. Petersburg. There are about a half a dozen imperial gardens in the city. While not as spectacular as the Peterhof garden, the grounds around Catherine Palace contain the same kinds of features: grass and trees and fountains and sculptures and flowers, and most of all, beautiful sweeping vistas. So now we're going to go another 10 degrees south to the Netherlands and a very different kind of garden. I have a little story to introduce you to this garden. Jim and I landed in the Netherlands really early in the morning and got to our Amsterdam hotel by about 6:30 a.m. and we were totally exhausted. We couldn't get into our room, of course. So we went to the hotel cafe to have some breakfast. An American couple was having breakfast next to us, and they asked us if we'd seen the Keukenhof yet. When we looked blank, they launched into dazzling descriptions of this garden, which was their sole reason for their trip to Europe. Well, of course, we had to go and decided to take a tour that day despite our exhaustion. The garden is in Lees. That's right here. I don't know if you can see the cursor. Here's Amsterdam. It's about 30 miles southwest of Amsterdam. An easy trip by bus, train, or if you take the tour from Amsterdam. We took the tour, which was fine for the first visit, but it didn't give us nearly enough time to visit these gardens. We were there for about 2 hours. We could have spent a day easily in there. We were incredibly lucky to be there in mid-April when the garden is open. Because it's a bulb garden, it's only open for 2 months in the spring when the bulbs are out. Then it closes for the rest of the year. The 79-acre plot has been a garden since the 15th century, when it was the kitchen garden for a hunting lodge. In the 1800s, the lodge became a manor house for a minor aristocrat, and the garden was redone in the English style. After World War I, a consortium of bulb growers turned it into a showcase for their bulbs. The garden consists of several sections. Some are formal, like this area down here, and other are mostly informal, with the winding walks and curved beds. There are several sections, though, that are very geometrically laid out. The displays in this garden are stunning, partly because they're so large in scale. Every bed has hundreds or even thousands of the same variety of flowers, massed for the greatest effect. The garden contains over 7 million bulbs. Every year, the bulbs are replaced. After the flowers bloom, the bulbs are dug up and discarded. You can't buy them. Instead, they send them to farms for animal feed. I don't understand why they do that, but they do. Then in the fall, 7 million more bulbs are planted, I suppose featuring any new varieties that are ready for general sale. There's a river of grape hyacinths. I have no idea how many bulbs would be contained in that river. They had beautiful, perfect hyacinths. Somehow mine never quite look like that. There's a children's garden with whimsical structures, a formal garden with sheared evergreens and plants, but I don't think that the flowers look particularly formal, but they call this their formal garden. And they have displays of flowers that are made into famous pictures. This was a Mondrian painting, and the very first theme I thought was kind of neat. They said they did a theme of, quote, Holland, represented by a traditional canal house and a tulip, referring to the fact that when they first got tulips into Holland, a bulb cost as much as a house. This was the new painting the year we were there. Anybody know who that is? It's the famous Dutch painter Van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as the Dutch say. My question was, how can they ensure that the flowers come up at the same time? And how do they make them last for 2 months? They said they chose varieties that bloom at the same time. And then when they plant the bulbs, they dig a hole about 1 foot deep. Into the hole, they put 3 bulbs, one on top of each other. The top bulb blooms first, then the second, finally the bottom bulb. The varieties are labeled with names in these collections, as you can see here, these little blue signs. There are some 800 plus varieties of tulips in the garden, and it takes some 40 gardeners to tend, plant, and dig up the bulbs every year. This variety is tiny. It's only about 1 inch, maybe 1.25 inches across. Tulips originated in the Tian Shan mountain region in the Himalayas and came to Holland through Turkey around 1560. Have you noticed that the beds are curved? While there are some straight lines in the formal gardens, throughout the remainder of the walkways and the beds are curved. The designers feel curves are more natural and restful. Here, the flower varieties are generally separated from one another more than in the bigger beds. Beds are smaller with fewer flowers, but I think the displays are every bit as beautiful as the bigger beds. There are several whimsical plantings in the children's garden, as well as things like this that are tucked into some of the smaller pathways. Among the different garden styles in the Keukenhof is a rock garden. And by the way, if you don't remember from your Master Gardener training, the stripes on a tulip originally were caused by a virus spread by aphids, but now the breeders breed the tulips for stripes. The pond, fountain, swans all lend an Asian touch to this part of the garden. The stepping stones in our Japanese garden resemble these wooden ones. We don't have quite as many, though. And the bright green grass is a special, quick-growing variety needed to cope with the shady trees. It's reseeded every year. In 2019, 1.5 million people visited the Keukenhof in just 8 weeks. Compare that to 4 million people visiting Yellowstone during the whole year. And Yellowstone is 28,000 times bigger than this garden. In addition to the tulip gardens, the pavilion hosts about 30 flower and plant shows, several festivals, and even classical music concerts. Despite our exhaustion, our introduction to the Keukenhof was just unforgettable. I could have spent so much time there. Okay, the next stop is 10 degrees further south, and we're in southern Spain. These are the Moorish gardens. Moors were African Muslims which invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 711. They conquered the country to the Atlantic in the north and then were slowly pushed back by Christian forces. The three cities of Granada, Sevilla, and Cordoba still retain a great deal of Moorish influence, even though the reconquest was completed in 1492. The three cities are in the Andalusia region of Spain down here. Here's Granada and Cordoba and Sevilla. We experienced some of these sweltering temperatures that they talk about when we were in Granada. It was 106 degrees with a scorching wind blowing in from Africa, from the Sahara. So the first city is Granada, and this is where the Alhambra Palace is located. It was the last residence of the last emir, Boabdil, who was driven out in 1492. It was abandoned for more than 200 years and then rediscovered after the defeat of Napoleon in the early 1800s. It's on a bluff. This is a bluff overlooking the city of Granada, which is down here near the river. This is the entrance to the palace and grounds. The trees are sculpted cypresses, which are found everywhere in the garden. The tops are sheared off so that the trees resemble living columns. The Tower of the Princesses is right here. It was the last building built by the Moors and is classic in that the outside is remarkably plain, actually pretty ugly, I think. And the inside is very ornate, and you'll see the inside of some of the buildings in a minute. The name of the Tower of the Princesses, is linked to to the tale of the three princesses in Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. The gardens of the Alhambra are called what looks like general life, but in my pitiful Spanish, it's Generalife. Moorish gardens are composed of anything that can provide pleasure to the five senses: color, light, shapes, aromatic plants, and the murmur of water. Arab gardens are a representation of the longing for paradise. Water plays a major part. It obviously ensures an abundance of vegetation. It's present as fountains and pools and whimsical features. The Arabs were skilled at working with water, and this water comes from the foothills of the nearby Sierra Nevada mountains. And like the fountains at Peterhof, the difference in elevation in the mountains and in Granada causes the pressure to work the fountains. Cypress trees form dense screens and are used to make walled rooms in the garden. They are its most common plant. Roses and bougainvillea are two of the common flowers, and orange and other citrus trees, crepe myrtle, pomegranate, and palms are the other common trees. There are over 150 varieties of plants in the Generalife. The formal gardens of the Alhambra are mostly small courtyard gardens. In fact, any courtyard is called a garden, whether it has plants in it or not. Fountains are often the focal point. From the upper garden, you can see out over the city of Granada. The building on the left here is part of the palace. Again, note the plain outer construction. I want to contrast it with the ornate inner construction. The interior of the Alhambra is stunning. Every surface is covered with carvings in stucco of geometric patterns, Arabic poems, and inscriptions. No human forms are ever used. This is a very famous courtyard called the Lion Fountain Courtyard, and it's one of the Alhambra's most important examples of Muslim sculpture. The 12 lions hold a marble bowl inscribed with a poem in Arabic. 4 rills, which is this, and then there's 4 of them, one on this side, one on this side, and one in the back, are a feature symbolizing the 4 rivers of paradise, and it's a feature of many Islamic gardens. This courtyard is the innermost courtyard of the palace and was reserved for the Sultan and his harem. And interestingly, the only vegetation in this courtyard garden are 4 domed citrus trees in the corners. The Hall of the Ambassadors is another example of walls carved or covered with colored tiles. And the tiles are yet another characteristic of Moorish architecture and gardens. In the evening, the Alhambra is lit both inside and out. The lighting in this courtyard garden picks up the main colors of the flowers and seems to make everything glow. Now we're going to move to another palace and garden in Seville called the Alcazar or Alcazar, and it was constructed over a 500-year period, starting as a fortress, and it was added to, changed, and then when reconquered by the Christians in the early 1300s, it was turned into a palace and gardens by Peter of Castile. It's the oldest palace in Europe, still being used to house royalty. On the map, the green areas are the gardens, and there are formal parts, the nice little squares here and here, and then informal strolling areas. Notice the list of gardens, the names of the gardens here, they correspond to the dots on the map. so you can get around and know what you're looking at. The darker areas are intimate small gardens, almost like courtyards, while the lighter green area is more like an English landscape garden. The main trees in the Alcazar are palms. This old tower is part of an old mosque that was destroyed during the Reconquest. Peter loved Moorish architecture and included the tower and the ruins of the mosque in his plan for his palace. And this tower is now a beloved landmark of Seville. You can climb to the top of it for fabulous views of the city. The patio of the Doncellas is a reference to the apocryphal story that the Moors demanded an annual tribute of 100 virgins from the conquered Christian kings. The architecture here looks a lot like the Alhambra, but there is a subtle difference. Although the elements are Arabic, the subject matter is Christian, because obviously the Christians had reconquered this and built this palace. Therefore, the architectural style is not Moorish, but called mudahar, meaning allowed to exist. The Alcazar has been used in several movies. This patio was used as the set for the court of the King of Jerusalem in the 2005 movie, Kingdom of Heaven. This is a formal garden called the Hedge Maze. You can see they're quite small, and often you can't get into them. Here's another hedge garden room featuring a fountain and stone bench. The fountains are rarely decorated, but rather serve a spiritual function of cleansing and purity. Notice the lack of grass in these Spanish gardens. Sam, no grass. Grass demands too much water for this dry climate. They have stone walks, clay walks, sometimes cement, but many other things as well. Okay, this is the Pavilion of Charles V. It's a lovely building, quite delicate on the inside, and it's found in the Garden of the Alcove. The trees around this building are mostly citrus, orange and lemon, and when the fruit is ripe and falls and it gets smushed, the whole area smells like marmalade. The gardens have interesting names. There's Garden of the Dance, Garden of the Gallery, Garden of the Flowers, Garden of the Ladies, Garden of the Marquis, and so on. Many of the gardens have been re-landscaped over the centuries and reflect tastes from various eras. The Gardens of the Grotto is supposed to have an English influence. The building on the left over here is called the Galleria, and it's a covered walkway running the length of the gardens to an overlook of the Guadalquivir River and the University of Seville. It's a wonderful place to stroll on a hot summer day, to be able to see most of the gardens while staying out of the scorching sun. The Garden of the Poets is said to have a French influence. Then we went to the other end and we looked back at the gallery towards the palace. This area of the Alcazar was used as the set in the 1962 movie Lawrence of Arabia. On to the third Spanish city and my favorite place in Spain, Cordoba. I will just let you read this information. Cordoba is just a fabulous place. The gardens featured in the May festival are those of private homes, and consequently are smaller and more intimate than the royal gardens. During the festival in May, you can walk around the city and wherever there's an open door, you can peek in to see the courtyard. Here are some features of typical Spanish courtyard gardens. Again, no grass. Okay, we're going to take a look at some courtyard gardens. What features can you notice here? I think most everybody gets the wrought iron. These are some of the tiles around here. The glazed pots, which there's one hanging, and then the white plaster walls. The festival is a competition to find the most beautiful courtyard garden in Cordoba. It's a tradition passed down from the Roman times. What do you see here? You probably can't recognize, but the pots are hung on the wall by wrought iron hangers. During the festival, the streets are filled with color, the scent of jasmine and orange blossom, and the strains of flamenco. Some of the families even provide tapas and a glass of sherry to those who drop in for a visit. The courtyards are most often surrounded by whitewashed walls adorned with hanging flower pots filled with geraniums, jasmine, carnations, and orange blossoms. Many of the courtyards are tiny. This courtyard doesn't have a riot of color like some of the others, but the huge bougainvillea provide a single mass of color, and the other plants provide a more restful feeling. This courtyard has about every feature listed for Spanish gardens: fountain, Moorish lanterns, saltillo tiles, bench, terracotta pots, plastered walls, wrought iron, stone, and a lot of symmetry. Here are some more gardens, and I'm just going to let you look at them. This is quite a big courtyard. Okay, we're going another 10 degrees south and halfway around the world to China, to Suzhou, China. Suzhou is considered the birthplace of Chinese gardens. Starting about 1100, it became fashionable to have a private garden. Wealthy Chinese scholars started building and developing the classical Chinese garden. The garden of the humble administrator is one of 69 preserved gardens, one of 8 which together are considered a World Heritage Site. Suzhou is about 60 miles west of Shanghai. Now, I know that doesn't look like it's very far, but that's 60 miles to the sea. And because it's built on many small islands connected by bridges, Suzhou is considered the Venice of the East. Now, Westerners they lump Japanese gardens and Chinese garden styles together, but they're actually quite different. While both have water elements, rock gardens, and winding paths, Chinese gardens are an extension of the living quarters, with rooms or areas set aside for specific purposes, such as practicing calligraphy or reading or writing poetry. They feature decorative rocks which function like European statuary, and they're always enclosed by a wall. In fact, the Chinese symbol for garden has a square around it representing the wall. If you saw the Rodgers and Hammerstein 1962 musical Flower Drum song, you maybe remember the scenes that were set in the family garden. Now, I can't read Chinese, but I wanted to show you this map because the garden, which is outlined in this kind of orange color, it's so much water in the garden, ponds, and they don't really have fountains per se, but they have little waterfalls and things like that. I also wanted to tell you the story of the humble administrator. Apparently, this man, this is in the 1500s, had quite a reputation in the imperial palace for intrigues and demotions and promotions. And finally, he was kicked out. They say he retired, but he was kicked out. And he retired to his family land and began to work on the garden. Took a long time to complete the garden. And it's got so much stuff in it. It's just hard to believe. We were there in March, and the garden flowers had yet to bloom. So the garden staff brings in potted flowers for color. This is another way that Chinese gardens differ from the Japanese, which doesn't have flowers. In the photo, you can see the garden wall, several weathered stones. Here's one back here. Here's another one, functioning as the statuary, and carved screens like those that cover most of the windows in the garden buildings. This building has the classic Chinese flying eaves, another difference from the Japanese buildings. It was a raw gray day, but the garden was packed with Chinese tourists. But then everything in China is packed with Chinese tourists. There's more flying eaves, and another feature of Chinese garden buildings, a moon gate, round opening in the wall. This bridge is very classic. Most bridges are covered and have tile roofs. Not all, but most. Have you noticed the names of the buildings and bridges? This building has a really interesting name. Note the elaborate carved furniture, the lanterns with the classic red Chinese fringe tassel, the urns, glass windows, and artwork are all in the classic style. The pathways in Chinese gardens are exquisite. They're always paved, probably because the garden is an extension of the house. Japanese pathways are almost never paved and represent forest paths. Here's an example of a rock garden, and the flying eaves are toned down quite a bit here. Near Suzhou is Lake Taihu. Lake Tai is renowned for its limestone rock formations, or scholar stones. The chemistry of the rock and lake combine to carve out fantastic shapes in the rock, which are prized as the statuary in Chinese gardens. Every Chinese garden in the world tries to have at least one stone from Lake Tai. Even the small Sun Yat-sen Chinese garden in Vancouver, British Columbia, has several of these stones. There's another walkway and lots more potted flowers. More stones from Lake Tai against the wall. We're going to talk about bonsais in a minute, but this is just an incredibly old bonsai with this giant trunk. And this photo shows the classic elements of the wall, the carved window screens, flowering plum and azaleas, and roof tiles. These classic garden tiles have a wonderful function we'll talk about in a minute. Here's another beautiful old bonsai. This one is a deciduous tree that hadn't bloomed yet or hadn't blossomed out. As we were exiting the garden, we went through another moon gate. We got a good look at these roof tiles. This tile, the bottom tile here, is called a drip tile or bat tile from its shape. Rain drains from the flanking tiles onto the drip tile and then is funneled into a stream of crystal beads, forming a lovely water curtain when it rains. Now, continuing further south, I couldn't find a garden at 20 degrees or 10 degrees, so I combined them and chose the garden which is halfway in between. This is a garden in Vietnam, and in Vietnam, a pagoda isn't just a structure, but rather is a temple complex where nuns and monks live, study, teach, and worship. The Tien Mu Pagoda, or Pagoda of the Celestial Lady, is in the imperial city of Hue. Here's Hue. It's about halfway from south to north. The Emperor Jialong succeeded in unifying the provinces way back when and made Hue his royal capital. It's now a World Heritage Site. The story from about 1600 of this pagoda says that a royal lord was out surveying his area and was told of a local legend which said that an old lady appeared, foretold that a nobleman would come and erect a pagoda on a nearby hill to pray for the country's prosperity, and then she disappeared. The Lord immediately constructed a temple on the site. The temple complex has been enlarged many times with the central octagonal tower, which is what we usually think of as pagoda, built between 1844 and 1846. The complex now covers about 5 acres. It's mostly hidden in this picture by the trees. This tower has become a symbol of Hue. Okay. The ideal way to approach the pagoda is by boat on the Perfume River. The boat dock at the foot of the stairs was cursed in another story. A wealthy young girl loved a poor boy, but they weren't allowed to marry. They decided to commit suicide and drown themselves by the boat dock. The boy drowned, but the girl was saved, and then forced to marry a wealthy mandarin. In time, she forgot her first love, and the boy, whose spirit lived under the water at the boat dock, cursed visiting couples, saying anyone who landed there would fall out of love. Many Vietnamese who believe the curse won't go near the temple. Here are antique stone pillars with engraved poems on the entrance steps. Behind the tower is the courtyard with the bonsai garden. Bonsai means tray planted in Japanese, and you can see that the trays are very shallow. Bonsai specimens are ordinary trees and shrubs dwarfed by a system of pruning the roots and training the branches with tying with wire. The art originated in China roughly 1,000 years ago, but it has spread the length and breadth of Asia. The direct inspiration for bonsai is found in nature. They represent trees that grow in rocky crevices of high mountains or that overhang cliffs, which remain dwarfed and gnarled throughout their existence. The aged look of the trunk and the branches and the weathered character of the upper roots is highly prized. Good bonsai specimens are usually hardy species that can be kept outdoors where the winters are mild. They can be conifers which represent immutability, or deciduous trees, which lose their leaves in the fall and flower the next spring, representing renewal. The selection of the appropriate container is an essential element of the art. Bonsai pots are usually earthenware with or without a glaze and may be almost any shape. If the pot is round, the tree is placed slightly off center. Usually there is a front or viewing side, but in this garden, the bonsais are viewed from all angles. Bonsais must be repotted every 3 to 5 years, depending on the root growth. Gradual root pruning during transplantation reduces the size of the root ball so the tree can ultimately go into the desired small, shallow container. Water, especially in this hot climate, must be provided on a daily basis, and in the hot season, sometimes twice a day. Fertilizer is added and pruning is continuous, and these are all duties of the temple's monks. This is an old banyan tree. Bonsais can live for centuries, becoming more and more valuable with age. They are cared for and passed on as a valuable family possession. There are other gardens in the temple complex. This is the shrine of Bodhisattva in the Temple of Relatives. And finally, this is another little scene featuring Asian pruning on plants with the intense green of the tropics. Our last and most varied garden is Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. Singapore is almost on the equator, hot, tropical, and rainy. Its official name is the State of Singapore, and it's a tiny country of 260 square miles, an island nation, but it's associated with the Federation of Malaysia. It's basically a city-state. And the Garden by the Bay, were created to provide a large green area for recreation and education in a country that doesn't have very much room. The 3 waterfront gardens are located on reclaimed land in the Marina District. Together, these gardens cost $1.03 billion to build. Billion. And that doesn't even consider the cost of reclaiming the land from the sea. The largest section is Bay South at 130 acres. This is in Bay South. The photo shows 2 super trees, tree-like structures that dominate the landscape with heights ranging up to 160 feet. They are vertical gardens that perform a multitude of functions, including housing plants, shading, and working as environmental engines for the gardens. We were in the gardens for over 4 hours, and all we saw were the flower dome and the enclosure next to it, the cloud forest. My cursor is not working at this point, but the flower dome is right at the top. We were there for about 4 hours, and that's all we saw, were those 2 buildings. More about the super trees. They are home to enclaves of unique and exotic ferns, vines, orchids, and bromeliads. They're fitted with environmental technologies that mimic the ecological functions of trees. For example, photovoltaic cells harness solar power, which is then used in the park for lighting. They collect rainwater to use in irrigation and fountain displays, and they serve as intake and exhaust functions as part of the conservatory's cooling system. As we walked toward the flower dome, we passed the entrance to the children's garden. We didn't get into it. It's located near an adventure trail, which consists of trampolines, balancing beams, hanging bridges, and of course, they're all in a garden-like setting. Immediately in front of the flower dome, we saw the first of the root sculptures. The root sculptures became one of my favorite features of the garden. The ants are on the tree are not exactly a root sculpture, but I thought they were pretty cool. The exhibits like this are so creative and artistic, and they all relate back to gardening in some way. Inside the flower dome, there are no rooms, but it is divided into sections, displaying a variety of biomes. This room displays orchids. The wooden statuary is another repeating theme of the gardens. Statues are found everywhere in the plant displays and lend a human touch to the flora in these vignettes. While the orchids in the last photo require high humidity, the room right next to it displayed succulents and cacti. And this was made possible by the sustainable technologies used to produce different weather conditions in the flower dome. Here's an interesting display of fish in a cactus garden. I think the cacti sort of resemble coral. This was an area that featured Australian plants. And those trees are bilbao trees, and there are some interesting statues in there. We were told these olive trees were hundreds of years old. I would have loved to have seen them moving this tree into place when the flower dome was built. When we were there, the cherry blossoms came out, and they are truly a spectacular sight. There are other heritage gardens highlighting the various cultural groups in Singapore, and there are many, and the important roles that plants play in the respective cultures and cuisines. They also focus on economically important plants in Singapore and Southeast Asia. This children's area is not the children's garden. It's an area that features children's characters made of flowers, scenes from classic children's books such as Alice in Wonderland, and other vignettes appealing to children. Here's Absalom the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland, but what I liked here was the display of succulents in the landscaping. One of my favorites was the Lego garden. All the plants are made of Legos. Flying overhead is a root sculpture of a dragon. And below, under a toadstool, is a terrified little girl. I thought this might be the yellow brick road on the way to Oz, but the city of Oz should be emerald green, and this is not, so I'm not quite sure exactly what it is representing. Leaving the flower dome, the walk to the cloud forest takes you through the floral fantasy, which consists of 4 garden landscapes showing different types of floral artistry and a futuristic ride simulating the journey of a dragonfly flight through the gardens. That was just spectacular. The cloud forest is a slightly smaller building and replicates the cool, moist conditions found in tropical mountain regions between 3,300 and 9,800 feet. It has a 138-foot cloud mountain accessible by an elevator. You take the elevator to the top, and then the visitor walks down via a circular path past a 115-foot waterfall and several various gardens with different themes, each with its typical collection of plants. This is the moss garden, and it was just beautiful. Jim was not thrilled with the path that jutted out over the edge of the mountain and provided fantastic views of the plants and sculptures below. Even here was a root sculpture door frame. This was called the Secret Garden. The circles are magnifying glasses that allow you to see tiny plants and animals that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to see. The walk down took about 45 minutes, depending on how much you stopped to check out the plants, gawk over the railings, or take photos. And at the bottom was another type of garden of stalactites and stalagmites. Interesting in that Singapore has no caves. And finally, I wanted to show you the super tree grove, even though we never got there. We saw a few small clusters of super trees up close, but not this grove. The grove has an elevated walkway so you can enjoy a panoramic view of the gardens. At night, it comes alive with a coordinated light show known as the Garden Rhapsody. Besides music and light, the show features excerpts from movies like Jurassic Park and Pirates of the Caribbean. We want to go back to Singapore for lots of reasons, but the main reason is to see the rest of this garden. So I hope you enjoyed that tour.